Well, dear participants of our conference, it is my real pleasure to introduce Mr. Kevin Appleby, Senior Director of International Migration Policy for the Center for Migration Studies of New York and the Scalabrini International Migration Network. These are the institutions that we don't really have to present. They're so well known, so I'm really glad that Mr. Appleby will deliver one of our keynote speeches at this conference, Global Initiatives in Refugee and Migrant Education.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. My name, again, is Kevin Appleby. And let me just tell you real quick a little bit about Center for Migration Studies and Scalabrini International Migration Network. The Center for Migration Studies is located on East 60th in Manhattan. It was founded in 1954 by the Scalabrini fathers, who are a Catholic religious order based in Italy. And their charism is caring for migrants. They have 270 programs around the world providing services to migrants. So they're really on the ground and understand the reality of migration, which often those in the capitals or the halls of the UN might not get. So they bring a particular expertise. And with that expertise, they wanted to be part of the process of influencing the global compacts, which I'm going to talk about today. Two of them. The first, the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and the second is the Global Compact on Refugees. And I must say that my work was more toward the Migration Compact because it was based in New York. All the negotiations were here. The Global Compact on Refugees, all their negotiations were based in Geneva. So I don't have as much intimate knowledge on what the politics there were. I mean, I can provide an educated guess for you, but with the Migration Compact, that'll be more of the focus of my talk. Just to put things in context, you know, migration was not an issue that was really discussed a lot in the UN maybe 15, 20 years ago. It was sort of like the third rail. You left it to the national sovereigns to decide their laws and how they want to handle migrants that come. It was looked at as the purview of nation states, and it shouldn't be questioned, frankly. And there's a lot of that still today, as we know from reading the media. But the significance of the Global Compact on Migration is it is a historic document that it's the first real multilateral framework for managing migration globally. And because it is that, it is an achievement, even though we might not have, you know, achieved everything we wanted in the document. It is that framework that nations can go by and advocates can use moving forward to hold nations accountable to a certain standard of treating migrants. So it is significant. But what I wanted to talk about with regard to the compact is give you a little glimpse as to what the controversial issues were and how they were resolved and how we can interpret them moving forward and how we can promote the compact in the best light, you know, interpret it in a way that is fully implemented based on human rights and the protection of migrants. So that is really the focus of my talk here. Another little side note is, you know, my history, my career has been mostly in Washington and advocating on Capitol Hill with the administration. And I must say, it took me a while to figure out the diplomats and the UN because their style is much different. They're not as in your face. They read their statements. They're very careful in what they say, but you have to know the code words that they're talking about. And it takes a little, you know, observing to understand what they're saying and what the cross currents are. And in that, what we all learned in observing this negotiation is that it's also a significant event because it was negotiated in a political environment that was very difficult and continues to be very difficult. Xenophobia, nationalism, even racism is pervasive in different parts of the world now. And that had an impact on how some nation states have reacted to the compact, how they postured with the compact, and what they will do with it moving forward, including, unfortunately, our current government here in the United States. So with that in mind, let me delve a little bit into what some of the issues were and how they were resolved. So the overall issue with the Global Compact on Migration was, it's titled Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. So how do you achieve that? And there was a difference of opinion in the room, and there are those in the middle, and there's a balance, but you had, not to oversimplify it, you had a group that was like, more legal avenues. Let's create legal protections. Let's facilitate migration so that we can manage it better. Others were looked at it as if enforcement is the answer. To encourage safe, orderly, and regular migration, we need to enforce our borders and, provide, in some cases, deterrence to people who migrate irregularly. One of the controversial issues in the room was, how do you treat regular versus irregular migrants? Do you classify them differently? Does the whole compact apply to both groups? And the European Union and other European countries said, we need a distinction in each of the paragraphs or each of the sections. This doesn't apply to irregular, this applies to regular. And there was, to the credit of the co-facilitators, they were able to not do that. They would change certain language in the text to make it clear what a principle applied to or who a principle applied to. But in terms of broad distinctions, there are none in the compact. So that was quite an achievement. So the other overall sort of theme was, and in our statement, our opening statement by the Scalabrinis, we made this point, that there's a model on the ground and there's what they're trying to achieve. What's the model that we see around the world now? Unfortunately, we see deterrence as the model to control large movements of migrants and refugees. We see it in Asia with offshore processing, interdictions. We see it in our hemisphere with the Central Americans. We saw it in Europe with the agreement between the EU and Turkey on the Syrians. And we continue to see it in parts of Africa. So our question to the diplomats was, how is the GCM going to bridge that gap? Can we change the current reality on the ground that we see, which is deterrence, the externalization of borders, et cetera, into a model that is more based on human rights, based on individual protection, that facilitates migration in a way that it can be better managed. And the jury's still out. Certainly the implementation, we'll see how that turns out. I'd also characterize the compact as a compromise, and the definition of a compromise is that everyone walks away from the table not completely happy. Not everyone got what they wanted. Some of the states who wanted more strict enforcement didn't walk away completely happy. But as advocates, we didn't get everything we wanted. We didn't get the language we wanted on certain things as well. But that's the art of compromise and the art of making a viable document. Having said that, moving forward as advocates for migrants, we want to interpret the language broadly. And I'll give you a few examples. We need to interpret it as a ceiling as opposed to a floor, right? That certain things that are said is the floor, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. It's not the ceiling, that member states can go beyond what they put in the compact. They can go above it. Not that that's the limit of what they should be doing in terms of helping migrants. And then, of course, moving forward, and this is the hard part. We did a podcast with Maria Espinoza, who's the president of the General Assembly, and we said to her, you were elected at the worst time because it's really the hardest part of this process is implementation. Are member states really going to take this document seriously? It's non-binding. You know, they really don't have to implement the provisions. And she was wise. She goes, well, there's a lot of political will to make this work globally, and the private sector and the civil society is going to have to play a big role in ensuring that it works, that the pressure is there moving forward for member states to take the document seriously and to implement its provisions. So let me just give you a few examples of what the compromise was. So I go in naively to these negotiations thinking, okay, let's get, you know, we're all going to have a legalization, we're going to increase legal slots by X% so that we reduce irregular migration by Y by 2030, by Sustainable Development Goals. And it's a nice thought, but they weren't going there. And part of the problem there is they didn't want a big sort of target, an amnesty provision, you know, that they would have to go defend in their back to their populations. So, in terms of legal avenues, like you would think logically, legal avenues are the way to reduce irregular migration. Well, there was a disagreement on that in the room, whether that is actually true. You know, that it doesn't increase irregular migration because more people come. And I thought getting the word increase into the document, we're going to increase legal avenues. Just saying that would be relatively easy. It was very difficult to do. They settled on expanding the availability and flexibility of legal avenues. And I looked up expand. You think expand is increase? It's not necessarily that it means increase. You know, it might mean diversify as well. So, you know, it's really, there's a plausible deniability there, you know. But, as I said, we interpret that as if that is increase, you know. Look, this is what this says. You should be increasing legal avenues. You should be doing a regularization, etc. We don't have to, you know, take their interpretation of what the document means. On regularization, this is a torturous language here, you know. What does this mean? Develop accessible, expedient procedures that facilitate transition from one status to another, and blah, 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 and do a somersault. You know, I interpret that as a regularization program, you know. I mean, it's convoluted, it's got caveats, but in my interpretation, I'm going to say to my government and to other governments, this is a regularization program that you can achieve through this language and that you should look at doing. Labor migration, the same thing. Convoluted language, but at the end, the key word is permanent and temporary work, and the key word there is permanent. So we should have labor programs that bring in immigrants, you know, that are here with green cards, not just use temporary workers, which was another controversial issue. So it was an education for me how they went about this, but they tried to strike this balance between not, you know, pressuring the member states to do things they domestically would have a hard time doing, but also putting in language that allows them to take it to another level when the political winds may be shifting in another direction in the future. And in a certain way, there's a lot of brilliance there. As advocates, we fought for that, you know, we want legal avenues, we want a broad regularization, we want, you know, specific protections on returns. And the co-facilitators said, you know, they had other voices they had to listen to in the crowd and came up with compromise. Again, not everyone was happy. On enforcement, there's a section on border management which we paid particular attention to. What does border management mean? Does it mean detention? Does it mean pushbacks? Does it mean externalizing your border? Does it mean interdiction and return? So we combed that section for anything that would give member states the green light to do all these things. And we were fairly successful, but the provision in the chapeau, and I forgot to mention, the way that the compact's written is there's 23 sections, and there's a first paragraph in each section called the chapeau. And that's really all they're committing to, is the lead paragraph. And every subparagraph are examples of what they can do to achieve what's in the chapeau. So in the chapeau, they say facilitate safe and regular cross-border movements of people while preventing irregular migration. And we're like, okay, what does preventing irregular migration mean? And we raised that, and there was a big discussion on it, and a lot of member states said, well, that doesn't mean anything. We don't interpret it that way. But others may. You know, there could be a member state that says, oh, that gives me the green light to close my border or to work with the country next to me to interdict a large movement. You know, so again, it'll play out in how the compact is implemented. Externalization. Actually, I must say this one provision on externalization was a good provision because it talks about appropriate protection for migrants in situations of vulnerability, and also about protection. And that is really one of the themes that we pushed, that you don't only externalize enforcement, but you have to externalize protection as well. And that has to be a component of how you manage large flows of migrants. It can't just be the stick. You have to have protection elements in any strategy that you undertake. So that was positive language. The issue of criminalization came up at the end of the negotiation. There was language in the document that said that member states should make crossing a border a civil offense, not a criminal offense. And many member states pushed back saying, well, we already have laws that it's a criminal offense. And the US has a law along those lines. So they revised the language, and that's the language on it. And if you notice, it's that the sanctions are proportionate, equitable, non-discriminatory, and fully consistent with due process, but it doesn't say anything about civil. They took that out. So again, they allow member states to maintain their laws, but they try to push the ball a little bit forward, to make it a little bit more progressive and put some conditions on that. I must say that detention, which I think was section 13, objective 13, is really the most progressive section in the whole compact. And it was due to a lot of the detention groups working behind the scenes with many member states to get good language on detention. And to our credit, we were able to get in community-based alternatives of detention, which was mentioned twice, once in the chapeau and once in the best practices, as alternatives to mandatory detention of families, whatever the case may be. So we're going to take that language and we're going to say this is a best practice. In Marrakesh, they're going to have a conference in a few weeks to adopt the compact, and it'll focus on implementation. What are the best practices here? This is a pure example of where we can take a best practice and say, look, this is successful. You can put people in these ATT programs, you can put them in the community, they'll report for their hearings, and it's much more humane. They're able to get representation, and it's much more successful, and it's also less expensive. Also in the detention section, they moved forward on ending the practice of detention toward children, which was a huge step. In the New York Declaration, which was the precursor to the Global Compacts, it was only as a last resort. And moving it to ending the practice of child detention, even though it doesn't sound like much, that's huge in UN sort of parlance, because it says, we're gonna end this. We're gonna move to end this at some point. And many member states don't, because they argue, well, they're not really children. They're teenagers and they're a danger. But anyway, that was progress was made. Also that it should be used as deterrence, it was in there. And also those who abuse migrants in detention should be held accountable. That was language regarding that. So I thought that was a positive victory on that. There were other language dances on important issues that we tried to push. Family reunification. You know, family-based immigration is really under attack around the world, even here in this country and other places. So there was a real focus on labor, so we tried to insert family reunification where we could as part of the migration path. So, you know, it went from family unification to right to family life, which is a new term to me. You know, it's a common UN term, but what does that mean? I can go visit my uncle on weekends? I don't, it's not quite clear what that means. Again, how it's interpreted. A huge issue was on firewalls between, you know, if a migrant is taking advantage of a benefit program and they have to provide personal information, can that be used for enforcement purposes? We wanted firewalls in there, and a lot of states pushed back on that, so we got right to privacy. Again, will that win the day or not? We'll see. A big debate over what services that irregular migrants would be made available to them. And there was, the Holy See was very instrumental in this debate, and they said we need to list the things that they're available, that they can have. Housing, you know, medical care, education, to name a few. But in the end, they took those out. They took the list out. They just said basic services. So a member state can interpret that any way they want, really, unfortunately. But that was, again, where they tried to compromise. The term non-refoulement was taken out in the migrant compact, simply because they didn't want to apply that standard to migrants, even though it does apply to migrants, and it's been interpreted that way. But what they did is they just put the whole definition of non-refoulement in the compact without naming that term, you know, without putting that term. So a member state could say, oh, well, we're not bound by non-refoulement anymore. We can return people without due process because it's not even in there. You know, if that's being dishonest, but they could interpret it that way. And the last issue, which it's a good segue into the Global Compact on Refugees, is the whole group. It's really the whole ballgame. The whole group of migrants that are in vulnerable situations that have protection claims but may not meet the international standards for protection. And that's a large group. In any large mixed movement, especially look at the Central American situation, you have migrants that have protection concerns. Do they meet the refugee definition? Not in all cases. What definition is going to apply to them? What forms of protection could apply to them, knowing that if you return them, they could be returned to harm, even though under the letter of the definition, they may not be a refugee. And what happened was the Global Compact on Refugees punted on that. They didn't want any changes. They were very concerned, and UNHCR ran that process, that if they changed that at all, right? Let's take climate change, migrants. Fleeing from climate change, a huge issue. That's only mentioned once in the Global Compact on Refugees, and it's not really substantive. It's just an acknowledgement that there are climate change migrants. And so, you know, the compact, the Migration Compact had to include some of these migrants in vulnerable situations. Migrants fleeing generalized violence, for example, fleeing gang violence. And to their credit, they created the human rights standard that, you know, their human rights cannot be violated. Well, again, and then they tied it to, you know, different human rights declarations. Again, but I mean, I'm not an expert in international law, and I would love to see a paper written on that as to what rights are attached to that. But in the end, can they return someone still under that standard? And I think they can. So that was a huge issue in the compact. And there's a lot of good language there, but does it amount to protection that a refugee gets? I would say no. So let me talk a bit about the Global Compact on Refugees. Again, it was negotiated in Geneva. and the context here is that really that the 1951 Convention and the 1967 protocols are beginning to become insufficient, you know, to really meet the protection needs of refugees worldwide. We need another sort of model here to try to do this. And we also need to encourage the whole global community to contribute to this. And what the goal here was to create a document that creates a responsibility sharing model for refugees around the world. Because, you know, 80% of the refugees are hosted by 5% of the nations around the world. And a lot of them are very poor themselves, you know. So there needs to be a correction there in terms of how countries around the world should contribute more toward the protection of refugees. That was certainly the goal. And as I said, it was more of a restatement of current refugee law. There wasn't, let's open this up to climate change victims, let's create a gender category. Very cautious to not open that debate in terms of maybe weakening the current protections. So in some ways it was a bit disappointing. Although there was an emphasis on increasing refugee resettlement numbers, which have gone down significantly. There's a big section on that. And on protection under a framework called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, where you have a large flow of refugees and nations contribute certain things to the protection of those refugees globally, including resettlement, which UNHCR is piloting around the world. And also there was a section on trying to ameliorate drivers of refugees and particularly conflict. And the implementation is unclear. UNHCR was the chief facilitator of the document. They'll be the ones that try to use it to encourage member states to do more on refugees. And it was less controversial than the Global Compact on Migration because a lot of what it said is already in current law. So we'll see how that goes forward. You might have noted that the US voted against it the other day. There was a resolution to adopt it, and our good friends in the administration, in their wisdom, voted against it, even though it encourages responsibility sharing, which should be something that this administration would want to have, so they don't have to do as much. But sometimes they'd rather make a bigger political point than do what's in their interest from their perspective. Sorry, a little editorializing there. So we have these big compacts now, and they sort of work together moving forward. They're frameworks for how member states can work together to provide support and protection and to manage migration flows. There's a lot of voices in the room that are like, I'm going to ignore this. This is not us. We're sovereign nations. Sadly, we've got 4 nations. Let's see, we've got Austria, US, Hungary have pulled out of the Migration Compact. Talk that Czech Republic and Poland will do the same. That's fine. These things have happened with other international instruments before, and governments change. Just move forward with the implementation. So how can civil society, in their position, in their role, help to implement this compact? And again, this will be the hard part. And I would make the argument that civil society is the most important has the most important role here, because civil society, including universities, have the ability to influence their governments to take this document seriously and to implement its provisions. The UN apparatus isn't going to do that. There's an implementation section that creates a UN migration system to help implement the compact, but they have no authority to require member states to do certain things. They'll provide support. If they're asked, there's a funding mechanism that they'll provide grants, but otherwise, there's really no accountability mechanism that requires member states to do any of this. So it's up to civil society to really put the pressure on to move in this direction. So what can we do? Again, interpret provisions of the compacts broadly. As I mentioned, promote best practices on important issues. Like I mentioned, alternatives to detention could be one. Temporary protected status. That's an example of a best practice that helps migrants in vulnerable situations and has worked pretty effectively, notwithstanding what the administration is doing. But that's a tool that can be used in your toolbox. There are other examples around the world, regularization programs that have worked. So focusing on those best practices, encouraging the adoption of those best practices by member states is really the best effective way to go forward. Maintain a voice in the UN system, that civil society should have a voice in the UN system regarding monitoring support, but ultimately we have to organize in the capitals, you know. I mean, if civil society thinks, okay, we're gonna play with the UN and try to get this done, it's not gonna work. We need to show them that we can force, well, require, pressure governments in Washington, in Australia, in the EU, and around the world, you know, the destination countries, that they need to do these things. And civil society, including universities, are the only groups that can really do that, frankly, and the citizenry. The other thing is to monitor the worst practices. You know, will this change the reality on the ground? Are we going to be, you know, sending troops to the border? You know, are we going to have Mexico do our dirty work? You know, are we going to send back people without due process? Are we going to detain families? Are we going to separate families? You know, these are things that under the compact are contrary to the spirit of the compact, right? So we can use the compact as another tool to say, look, you're not even close to what the compact envisions and what it lays out, and we're calling you on it. And hopefully over time that'll move governments in the right direction. But ultimately we, you know, as universities do the best, we need to educate on what the compacts are, what they hope to achieve, and how they're a new model for governing migration moving forward that's based on human rights and the right to protection globally. And I think, you know, if you walk down the street, even the, you know, most educated population in this country, they probably wouldn't know what these things are. Because the only media coverage of it was when the U.S. pulled out of it, you know. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done. You know, it's a non-binding document, so there's a real risk it could just be cast aside at some point if there's not enough interest. So again, educating people moving forward is really important as to how this is really groundbreaking in a lot of ways and could really make a difference if implemented correctly. And how can you be involved, you know, as individuals, you know, pressure our government, you know, which is probably a lost cause at this point, but if there's a new administration in our future at some point, press them to rejoin the compact, not to withdraw from the refugee compact, etc. To be a leader globally on this compact, which the U.S. should be, frankly. You know, educate yourself and others, use the compacts as leverage, point out how deterrence policies I've said a lot of this stuff, counter the goals of the compact. Get involved in immigration reform efforts. You know, you have to sort of do the work at home as well to provide the example to other nations. This is what we're doing, you know, to implement the compact. We're going to provide a regularization program to our undocumented population. The refugee program is at risk. Get involved in preserving, expanding that as well. The point is, advocate on the domestic level as well to ensure that laws are adopted that reflect the values and the goals of the compact, and hopefully that can be used to encourage others to do the same. So in conclusion, these are two tools that time will, I think, judge them as historic sort of frameworks for migration governments that sort of moves us to another phase in how we deal with migration flows around the world. But we're a point where we need to really step it up and ensure that it's implemented in a way that we want to see it implemented, and that it really sort of becomes the guidepost for nations around the world and how they handle the rights of migrants moving forward. I've done a couple of articles. I'm finishing another article before the Marrakesh meeting on implementation, but they can be found at cmsny.org along with a lot of other things. So I encourage you to visit our website. So thank you. I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, and I'm really happy that we're taking into account the second point. We're educating, thanks to you, ourselves and others on the issues and promoting best practices at this conference. Thank you so much for an inspiring speech. I pass the microphone to you to take questions.
So Kevin, thank you for your leadership on this. He's really been amazing working at the UN and getting good ideas into the document. One concern I have, and I know we've talked about it, is the data and the fact that part of these compacts allow countries to collect data on people. And I know you talked about the firewall, but I wonder, if there's any protections for refugees and others who sometimes, data is really important, and sometimes they migrate with false documents or whatever, and how are we able to protect them in particular? Oh, and I also, one other thing I would add to this list is I'm the associate editor of the Journal on Migration and Human Security, which is also published by CMS. And so for those of you who are scholars in the room or interested in writing about issues related to migration protection, refugee protection, send your articles our way.
Well, thanks. Again, right, one of the ironies of the negotiations was EU opposed the firewall language pretty strongly. And one of our colleagues, who's based in Brussels, said, they all have laws with firewalls already, So why are they opposing it? I mean, it's what they do already. It's not new. And I don't know what the answer to that was, other than they didn't want to have a UN body tell them to do it. So there are laws that are in place, including in this country, where there are firewalls, or there's supposed to be firewalls. But again, it's one of those things where, you hope there's not slippage because of the language in the Global Compact, but we have to be vigilant and make sure that member states don't take advantage of what may be perceived as softer language on that. I don't know how any other way you can do that. I don't sense that it'll go that way, that member states will look at this and say, now I can use this information to apprehend people. I mean, it won't be based on, I think, what the Global Compact says. But we can use, in certain situations, the Global Compact to say you shouldn't be doing that. Right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a concern moving forward, definitely.
Hi. As regards implementation, is there talk in the international community of linking an index to each of the chapeaux and then create rankings? I don't know if that, in your opinion, could help to pressure governments. Obviously, some governments would consider it a badge of honor to be low on those rankings, but I think it could be helpful going forward.
Yeah, I don't know if there is a political will for that. I mean, we suggested a report like the Trafficking in Persons report that the State Department does, where you categorize progress, and it just wasn't going to fly. There is a paragraph that encourages them to create national plans and to report on those national plans. They'll have a conference every 4 years where they come in and they report. 2022 is the first conference. So there's that, and that can be used to encourage governments to have a national plan and to try to implement it. And civil society can also issue their own reports, you know, can as a way to hold governments accountable. What have you done on these 23 objectives? You know, F, 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 A, B, you know, and I think that could be a tool that could be used as well. But in terms of calling out people, I don't think there's a political will, at least in the UN, for that to be done. And you have to understand that the balance here was very delicate. You have a lot of the powerful nations that, you know, have governments that are to the right at this moment. And, you know, you just read the paper and you see that the political environment against migrants globally is not as good as it has been. And so there's a lot of concern that if you put certain things in, that member states would walk away. So that's why the document's written in a certain way that, you know, we have to interpret it broadly, you know, not narrowly, moving forward, because politics change and governments change and political views change. So it's something where we have to look the long term, you know, which is true of any international instrument, to see if over time it takes hold, you know. And you don't need to call people out. They want to do it. They want to beat each other to do the best. I think that's the ideal.
Hi, thanks, Kevin. Kevin Ahern here from Manhattan College, and I also work with the International Movement of Catholic Intellectuals, Pax Romana. One of my questions you were just addressing was relating to the reporting mechanism that's built into the compacts going forward. So how can we, even though the United States is not, at least in theory, going to be party to it, how can we be involved in getting universities and research centers here to create civil society reports? With the UPR process out of the human rights framework of the UN, it's always helpful to have some coordinating voices with that civil society action. I suspect we can find room, even if the United States doesn't have isn't formally there, to have shadow reports circulating. So is there a way that we can find a coordinating voice to look ahead to that next review conference? And who would play that role? Who could we as universities, academics look to? Maybe it's you, but who can play that role?
Well, first of all, I think there is a need for research, and there's a need for data, really, on, you know, numbers, the number of undocumented, et cetera, and having it cast in a policy light. And you can take any of these 23 objectives and look at it and create a report that sort of says, here's the reality on the ground, and here's what member states can do to address that reality. In terms of a coordinating voice, I'm not sure what you mean by that, in terms of to the UN or...
Universities, of civil society.
Right, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I mean, you know, the Catholic Association of Universities and Colleges, you know, have a committee that looks at these compacts and what research can be, you know, or reports can be generated that address some of the issues. Not on a domestic level. There's all sorts of that. Globally, you really need that scholarship globally. You know what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Africa. You know, how many people died in the Mediterranean. I mean, you know, how many people. You know, so that you have the aggregate numbers there, and you really understand what's going on. I mean, a lot of these negotiations, I must say, and one of the criticisms of this negotiation was that there weren't many migrant voices, if any. I mean, at one point we were like, let's bring the co-facilitators to one of our shelters and they can talk to migrants, you know, for a couple hours, and it'll blow their mind because they have no concept of why people leave sometimes, you know, and it wasn't an element there. So, you know, anything that can be done to really, this is really the reality of what's going on, and this is how far the global community is away from that reality. would be instrumental. And I thought that there was a gap there. You know, they were talking principles or talking theories, but there was no really interjection of like, well, this is really what's happening here. Or there wasn't a migrant voice, someone who was already in transit who could really tell their story about, this is why I'm doing this, and this is what I'm looking for, and this is, you know, I'm not here to take your country over, I'm just trying to survive. You know, things like that really needs to interject some of the reality into the process.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting. This may be a bit general, but could you maybe explain a little bit about the status of the legal enforceability of a compact versus a charter or a convention or other legal instruments?
Right. Well, I mean, the fact that it's a compact, I think the angle there is that, you know, we're committed. It's more of a bigger commitment to action, you know, is the sense that I got. I don't think there's a legal distinction that I see between that or a declaration or, you know, I mean, because they're all non-binding, you know. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, I think, is binding, or the Paris Climate Agreement is binding, and it means they have to do these things. And this, they don't. I think the word compact means sort of we're all in this together and we want to sort of police each other together and hold each other accountable together, but without, you know, legal requirements doing it. I think that's what they wanted to capture. But I don't think it has a legal distinction other than language and messaging.
Thank you so much. We have to close the questions now, but please let's close it with clapping our hands to Mr. Appleby. Thank you so much.